FY2022 na Legislature in Guam is back in session. Welcome back, colleagues. We are on second reading on Bill number 55-36 COR. Senator Joseph Augustine, you are recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, for the opportunity to briefly speak on Bill 55-36 COR as substituted by the Committee on General Government Operation, Appropriation, and Housing, which is an act making appropriation for the operation of the executive branch of the Government of Guam for fiscal year ending September 30th, 2022, making other appropriation and establishing miscellaneous and administrative provisions, introduced by the Committee on Rules, but by the request of Imaga Haga Guam, the Governor of Guam, in accordance with the Organic Act of Guam. Madam Speaker and my colleagues, over the past several months, the Committee on Appropriation and my staff, with the Office of Finance and Budget, has worked diligently to analyze and process the fiscal year 2022 budget request that was made by the Governor and her team toward ensuring our government's ability to continue providing the quality public service and programs that our people deserve and expect in the next fiscal year. This is no easy feat, with the various anomalies of what we as a people have experienced and realized because of the pandemic over the last year and a half. We have before us our best effort in what we consider to be our best revenue projections in the various categories of collections and made our best allocation of these appropriations after months of budget hearings and meetings with our government agencies and departments. The substitute bill before us is a culmination of the work that required additional analysis to consider that in FY22, we will not have the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program or other federal assistance programs from the pandemic. The CARES Act funds of over $1 billion no longer exist towards helping our island remain resilient. The new funds in the American Recovery Plan Act of over $550 million has yet to be distributed to help our island recover, when actually it's $600 million. While those federal funds have helped us stand strong, we cannot look at these monies as when we are discussing our FY22 budget. This budget bill is based strictly on what we determine to be the best outcomes on revenue projection, as we have always done. We took a look at historical data and the various factors of those years and applied the best results of those experiences when crunching the numbers for this budget. Over the next few weeks, we will have an opportunity to ask real questions and break down the numbers so that we can confidently provide our people with the best projection and physical resources toward the best quality service and programs for the coming year. I look forward to our discussion and stand ready to work with you and our colleague in accomplishing our job in creating the FY22 budget. Sidus Masi, Madam Speaker.
Sidus Masi, Senator San Augustine. This is our appropriations bill for FY2022, so we will now convene in the Committee of the Whole.
Committee of the Whole is called to order on FY22 Budget Bill 55-36 COR as substituted. I'd like to introduce the panels that have been invited. From my immediate right is Lester Carlson, Director of the Bureau of Budget Management Research. And we have Mr. Edward Byrne from the Department of Administration, Director. And we have Director Daphne Shimizu from the Department of Revenue and Taxation. And then we have Mr. Gary Howes from Department of Labor. He's the economist. Am I correct? Okay. On my left, I have Steve Guerrero, the Director of Office of Finance and Budget, and Chief Analyst Llewellyn Terlai. And I'll ask the panelists to please rise as you are sworn in by the Sergeant Arm.
Please raise your right hand. Under penalty of perjury, you will affirm that any and all information that you provide today, whether it be verbally, electronically, and in writing, be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help you God. Yes, Mr. Chair, we're all under oath. You may proceed.
Thank you, Sergeant Arms. My colleagues, the rules of engagement. Questions for the panel will be asked in 2 rounds. But before you get to that point, I would ask the panel to first make their introduction on the budget. Okay? With 2 rounds, it'll be 5-minute time limit for questions per senator per round. Please be reminded that if you yield your time, only one person can yield their time to any of our colleagues here. Once that is yielded, all that time is gone. It's given to the person that's allowed to speak. All right? Materials for the Committee of the Whole are in the shared Google Drive folder labeled 8.13.21 Committee of the Whole. Proposed amendment must be submitted in writing to the clerk via email 36glsession@gmail.com before the motion to amend is made on the floor. Amendments will be ruled out of order if it is not submitted and loaded to the session drive prior to proffering. Amendments will not be entertained until after the panel is dismissed. Bookmark. If a request is made to bookmark a part of the bill, the bookmark section will only be entertained up to the end of that chapter. And it is the responsibility of the requesting senator to ensure the bookmark is addressed. If the discussion or amendments to that chapter is completed, the bookmark is then retired with or without being addressed. My colleagues, I will continuously remind you of a bookmark before we get to the end of the chapter. So, senators who wish to increase an appropriation to an agency or department must identify the funding source and provide an explanation on the impact of both the receiving agency and or the defunded agency. My colleagues, I will now ask the Office of Finance and Budget to make their presentation of the budget. And then after them, then I'll ask the panels on my immediate right, Mr. Carlson or Mr. Byrne or Ms. Daphne Shimizu to make their presentation of the budget. Steve?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Madam Speaker, senators, and panel colleagues. My name is Steve Guerrero. I'm the Director of Office of Finance and Budget, and I am here today to present Bill 5536 COR as amended by the Committee on General Government Operations, Appropriation, and Housing, referred to as FY22 Budget Bill. I would like to start off by presenting the FY22 projected revenues and how it was formulated and derived. But before I continue, I want to briefly go back a couple of years to discuss how government revenues were projected. Traditionally, methods used to determine government Guam revenues involve using historical data, current trends, tracking of monthly revenues and economic conditions, and other pertinent indicators. Projected levels for each of these revenue categories may receive some or all of the methods mentioned. Adjustments are made to revenue categories to account for anomalies and or non-recurring events not normally included in projecting annual government revenues. Projection methods used in project FY2020 revenues was in itself a challenging year to project for. Income tax categories affected by changes in both local and federal tax, specifically the Trump Tax Act and the Jobs Act of 2017, which took effect in the middle of FY 2018 and continued on to 2019. At the start of 2020, revenue collections were at above projected levels for the first 4 months of the fiscal year, which set an historic revenue collection period for Guam. Year-end projection trends at that point were expected to surpass initial revenue projection levels, with then robust collections in most revenue categories. Then the unexpected and unimaginable event occurred, which drastically and practically over a short period of time altered the collection trends and economic environment of the island. That was the impact of COVID-19 pandemic. Since February 2020, which many consider the beginning of the COVID-19's presence locally, its impact has been immediate and direct on the island's economy, most especially those in the private sector. The loss of jobs and or reduced working hours, closing of businesses, zero tourism arrivals, reduced consumer spending, etc., contribute to the loss of hundreds of millions of dollars by local businesses. The government of Guam also experienced the effects of the pandemic through the reduction in revenue collections and the curtailing or closure of program services. Determining FY 2021 revenues was a unique period to project government revenues. Aside from using traditional projection methods and facing the same scenarios experienced in FY 2020, other considerations such as the implementation of additional new tax laws and changes, the experience of a full-year impact of the Trump Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2019, the economic and financial impact brought on by the pandemic, status of island businesses sector, and the future of tourism industry of Guam were important factors in determining the FY 2021 revenues. Based on the June 2020 CREO report, revenues for income tax for individual income, corporate income, withholding tax reflects an increase of about $41.1 million in revenues collected over FY 2021. Adopted revenues total for these categories. However, revenue collections and business privilege tax reflect a decrease of $23.5 million and Section 30 funds of about $3.5 million over FY21 projected revenues, respectively. Other revenue categories also reflected a combined shortfall of $3.8 million. In total, general fund revenues is favorably anticipated to collect projected revenues by $11 million by the end of the year, despite these shortfalls in these categories. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for many of the special fund revenues. The 6 major special fund categories are currently tracking below projected revenue collections, with a projected combined total of $20.9 million by the end of the fiscal year. As of the FY 2021 June CR report, the programs listed and amounts rounded are typically the Guam Highway Fund, trailing at $2.9 million, Solid Waste Operation, tracking below at 1.5, the Territorial Education Facility at 3.4 million, Tourist Attraction Fund at 6 million, Healthy Future Fund at 3.1 million, and the Custom Inspection Service Fund at 2.5. Departments and programs funded by these special funds will require the general fund subsidy to cover program expenses going forward. Revenue projections for FY22, I believe, are conservative based in part on historical trends, revenues, current economic conditions, tourism industries, financial impact of the COVID-19, and economic assumptions. A detailed presentation of the FY22 revenue projection will be presented in a PowerPoint presentation shortly. While there is no doubt that the receipt of Coronavirus Relief and Economic Security Act and American Recovery Plan funds and the continued military contracts and other pandemic federal assistance funds has helped mitigate revenue losses in both the private and government coffers, the anticipated impact of the local economy and government on the local economy and government revenues. Reduction in federal assistance is set to commence September 2021, beginning with the termination of the PUA program. Other federal pandemic assistance programs are set to expire over the next several years. And while the island has made tremendous strides over the last 18 months to prevent, control the spread of COVID-19, the recent rise of reported cases over the last 2 weeks and the possibility of reinstating restriction guides may jeopardize the already fragile and volatile economy. The impact and exact loss of federal assistance money is unclear, but what we do know is the need to prepare for the plan for the island's self-economic stability, which must be done soon. Several local economists and financial officials have stated the island's economic recovery period may take 2 to 3 years to revert to pre-COVID economic status. It is my hope that the island's economic recovery will be attained by then. I would like to thank the following departments and agencies, basically for the contribution in developing the FY22 annual budget, BBMR, Department of Revenue Taxation, Department of Administration, Guam Visitors Bureau, Department of Labor, Guam Economic Development Authority, and private accounting officials who have contributed their personal expertise to the outlook and welfare of the government of Guam. I and the OFB staff are available to answer the questions you may have regarding Bill 5536 UR as substituted by the committee. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Director, if I'm correct, your chief will be presenting the slides of the director will present the slides of fiscal year 2022. If we can have the slides, please put on the screen. Turn on.
Next slide, please. Okay, this slide actually just presents the overall summary of revenues that are going to be available for appropriation. The general fund revenue available for appropriation is rounding off to about $117.5 million, which is available for general fund operations. We have 21% coming from the special funds, totaling $196.7 million, and then federal matching grants and aids totaling $1.5 million, which represent 12% of the total. Next slide, please. Okay. This is the FY22 general fund allocation based on OFB's recommended levels. There is a comparison on the first column there on the FY21 authorized level. And the second column is the FY22 executive request. And then the third column that is bold is the FY22 OFB recommended level, which is what's reflected in the bill. So if you look at the total for income taxes, under the FY21 authorized, we have a total of $387.9 million. The executive budget has a slight decrease of about $380.5 million, and OFB's level is concurrent with the executive request at the same at $380.5 million. So we're okay with what's being reflected in the executive request regarding income taxes. The business privilege tax, the current authorized level for the BBT is $309.4 million. The executive request is at $299.6 million, and then the OFB level is $243. This is where we have kind of a huge disparity in how we view how the BBT is going to perform or what's going to happen to BBT in FY22. We will have more discussion on that as we go further into the budget. Federal sources, for FY21, currently we have about $70.2 million for FY21. In FY22, executive budget request is at $66.9 million, and OFB level is at 77.9. I just want to make it, just for point of clarification here, we were informed that this week, that we are receiving approximately $76.4 million in Section 30 funds in FY22. And this was relayed over to me by Director Bureau of Budget Lester Carlson. So that's why we updated, our number is higher. But they are in agreement that the number is 76.1 with special funds. Use of money and property. In FY 2021 budget, it's $1 million. The executive budget and the OFB is estimating at $428,000. So there's approximately about a $600,000 drop in that category. License and fees and permits. Current level is at 4.9 million. Executive budget has at 5.2, and we have it, the OFB has it down at 3.5. And I guess the variance here is based on information that we received that the decrease in about $2 million is as a result of the reduction in business license expected for FY22. Okay. Department charges. Pardon? Oh, yeah, the reduction in the license and fees between the executive budget request of 5.3 and OFB's level is 3.5 is because of the how do you see, the waiver of business license as a result of the recent law that was passed. That was estimated to be about $2 million. Okay, moving on. Departmental charges. The FY21 authorized level is at 1.2 million. The executive budget request is about 1.4 million, and an OFB recommended level is also at 1.4 million. So in total, as compared to the FY21 authorized level of 630 million, the executive budget is at 610 million, which represents about a 20 million decrease, and the OFB level is coming in at 617.5 million, which is about 7.3 million. I mean, 7.3 million over the executive budget's request. Next slide. Okay, this slide shows basically the breakdown for the provision for tax refunds, and the way we're displaying it here is kind of like different from the way it was presented in the FY21 and FY22 executive budget. And the only difference here is that although we know that annually the gross provision for tax refunds is coming in about 145 million, how the amount that's set aside for the tax provision was calculated a little bit differently. But in the presentation, the way the OFB is presenting this, it just shows what is being deducted and set aside and what the balance is from that amount. So if you look at FY21 authorized level, just for presentation purposes, it shows 145 million. It shows also the 20 million that we set aside, or is actually reimbursed, or has been reimbursed to the government of Guam for the additional child tax credit. And you take the sum of that, it comes up to 125 million. That is the amount that's reflected in the FY21 budget. Of that, and then we got the general fund provision for tax, the GMH pharmaceutical fund, which is 18.8 million. That's representative of 6.19% of the total business BBT that is collected in the year. That is set aside by law for GMH. Also set aside is the Harmon Industrial Roadway Park, which is at 250,000. Oh, yeah. And then the Better Public Service Fund is at $490,548 for total subsidy of $144.5 million. If you look at the second column, that was for 21. If you look at the second column, which is the executive budget request, again for comparison purposes, we put up the 145 million, which is the total payout, projected payout for tax returns, which again subtract the additional child tax credit, and then you come back to the 125 million that's normally set aside. Same thing, we set aside 6.19% of the total BBT for the pharmaceutical fund, which goes to the hospital at 18.2. We also set aside 175,000 for the industrial roadway, which is a reduction from previous year, and that's basically as per law. Better Public Service Fund, again, comes in at 10%, which shows about $527,676 for a total subsidy for FY22 executive budget request of 144 million. Now the last row is the OFB recommended level. We have the 145 million, and then the earned income tax credit is estimated at 55.8 annually, which is the amount that was calculated over the last 4 or 5 years. Of that amount, we set aside the 35 million for the Healthcare Center of Excellence, and we also set aside the additional 5 million, which is for the new Department of Corrections facilities. Okay, that leaves a balance of about 15 million. And we also have the child tax credit, which is advanced and regular, coming in at 31.6 million, and the additional child tax credit reimbursement of 23.5 million. So if you add the sum of these amounts and subtract it from the 145, what needs to be appropriated and set aside in the budget would be $74 million. Unlike last year, we set aside 125, but this year, for presentation purposes, it's only 74.1 being set aside. Again, for the pharmaceutical funds, it's 16.19% of the total business privilege tax. The Harmon Industrial Roadway Park Roadway is 175,000. Better Public Service Fund is again at 350,762 for a total subsidy of $89.4 million. Next slide, please. This slide just basically comprises of the amount allocated to the different branches, departments, and agencies and programs in the government of Guam for FY22. The first circle there is public education, coming in at 336.7 million, which represents 38% total general fund. Protection of life and property at 97.1, at 16%. General government at 95.4, represents 15%. Reserves at 73.5%, and the reserves basically can be, those agencies can be found on the following page, which consists of the Legislature, Office of Finance and Budget, Unified Judiciary, Public Defender Corporation, Mayor's Council of Guam, Public Accountability, Office of the Attorney General, Guam Visitors Bureau, Guam Election Commission, and the Guam Board of Accountancy. All those agencies and branches fall under this reserve category. The debt service comes in at 59.7 million, which represents 10%. Public health, 39.9%, 39.9 million at 6%. Individual and collective rights at 5.9, 1%. Economic development, 4.5 at 1%. Recreation at 3.4 million at 1%. And community service, rounding off at $1 million. That comprises of the total distribution of revenues, general fund revenues. Okay, slide 7, please. The next slide. One more, next one. Thank you. Okay. This slide basically shows the allocation of special funds for FY2022. We start out basically more just the larger funds that represent the bulk of the special funds, and coming in requiring the most out of the special fund is the Healthy Future Fund. Current budget is 42.7. The request is 42 million. OFB level is also at 42 million, so we're okay. We're okay with that. Guam Education Facility Fund, FY21 budget is at 38 million. The executive budget is at 34.6, and the OFB level is 34.6. Guam Highway Fund, 21.6. There is a decrease to about $1 million to 20.6, and OFB level is again at 20.6. So we're okay with that. We concur with that. Solid Waste, again, saw a slight drop of about $250,000 from 19 million in 21 budget to 18.9 in the FY22 request, and we are slightly, OFB is slightly below, about 400,000 at 18.7 million. Pharmaceutical funds, current budget is at 18.8, executive budget is 18.2, the OFB level is at 14.7. And the reason why you see a drastic drop, again, is because the difference in the business privilege tax. Tourist Attraction Fund, FY21 budget, we have it at 18.3. Executive budget is at 15.8, and we also are at 15 point for OFB. School Lunch Reimbursement Fund is at 12.5. Executive budget is 12.5 million, and FY22 OFB level is at 12.5 million. Custom and Quarantine, current budget for FY21 is at 4.1. The executive budget request is at 4.9 million, and the OFB projected level for the Custom Quarantine Fund is 2 million. And the combination of all the other funds represent a total of 35.3 million. The executive budget has it at 34.8, and OFB, actually we have an increase of about 670 million. 6 million, 7,000 at $35.6 million. So if you look at the bottom line, the total amount for special funds for FY21 is at 210.7 million. The executive budget request is at 202.6 million, and the OFB recommended level is 196.7. Next slide, please. Okay, this slide basically represents the allocation by percentage and the amount by category of the special funds. Got general fund representing 31%. General government representing 31% at 60.1 million. Public health 26% at 50.2 million. Budget education 18% at 36 million. The reserve category comes in at 10% at 19.3 million. Protection of life and property at 8% at 16.6 million. The debt service, 4% of special funds, totaling 7 million. Community service, 2% at 4 million. Individual collective rights takes about 1% at 2 million. Economic development amount is 761,000, and recreation at 549,000. And that is my presentation, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Director Guerrero. My colleagues and to the people of Guam, the administration will now present their comments to the budget, but please keep in mind that their budget was presented in January, and there's there's quite a few items that have changed since then. So I ask Mr. Carlson or anyone on the panel. Sir?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and half a day, everybody. If I could get OFB's presentation put back up on the screen, I'd like to be able to make a couple of very quick comments. Starting on page 3. As the chairman mentioned, the executive budget request was submitted to the legislature in late January. At the time, we had Section 30 at $65 million, a very conservative number because of our belief that there was continuing war claims and other things that would result in that number. I believe it was last week when I called Mr. Guerrero to let him know that the solid number verified to us by Department of Interior, excuse me, is $76,141,259. So if you were to take the executive budget request and just make the adjustment that we all just found out about, that number at the bottom for the executive budget request should reflect $622 million, all things being equal, because we just received the information. There's also something I'd like to point out, and I congratulate all of you for being a very significant part of this, is that debt service has reduced significantly in fiscal year 22, primarily due to some of the initiatives that this body passed, most notably the BPT refunding. So what used to be $90-some million in debt service is correctly identified in the substitute bill on page 11 at about $66 million. And Mr. Guerrero pointed out that some of that's general fund money, some of that's special fund money. Collectively, you get to the $66,745,638. I'd like to also make a, if we go to slide 4. This was also presented to you, I believe, by OFB as part of the stuff that was passed out. This one I'm holding up here. Just for clarification purposes, the executive budget request for the provision for income tax refunds was not $145 million. It was $125 million. So for clarity's sake, I just would like to point that out. I'm just saying that this spreadsheet actually does have the 125, so I thank OFB for that. So this one here actually is representative of what the executive budget request was. This slide on page 4, unfortunately, carries the 145, which is not correct.
So it should say 125 million for
Yes,
the
ma'am.
executive request for gross provision tax refund?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Madam Speaker, when you look at the sheet, please take a look at it further down. It identifies general fund provision for tax refunds is 125. The top part is where they identified the 145. Okay?
So I just want to be able to point out that there are some differences in where we arrive at net revenues available for appropriation. Thankfully, we're not that far off, to be quite honest with you. If you were to take what it is that what the adjustment on the Section 30, and OFB has done a nice job in allocating the debt service savings in the general fund to offset the special fund losses. And when I take a look at the allocations that follow the revenue appropriations, you know, I'm very heartened that government operations, for the most part, and I recognize Senator Torres's comment recently about the nurse pay, that, and there might be a couple other things that we missed, but thank you, Senator Torres, for pointing that out. But there are some differences, but what I would like for us to do now is to have Director Shimizu walk us through some understanding of the middle part of the budget where OFB undertakes an exercise to arrive at the $74,093,634 provision for income tax refunds, because I'd like everybody to understand how the EITC and the CTC is going to be treated. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Director Shimizu.
Thank you, Director Carlson. With regards to the provision for tax refunds, and in particular, if we look at the line for earned income tax credit reimbursements, which is at $55.8 million. So for FY2022, of course, as a result of the ARP Act of 2021, it's going to be the first time that that Guam government is going to be able to be reimbursed for this amount. This particular provision, though, is something that we're still...
I'm sorry, Daphne. Could
I'm
you just
sorry.
tell us which document you're on?
Oh, I'm on page 4. I apologize.
The actual bill?
Page 4 of the presentation.
Oh, okay.
I apologize.
The slide that
I
we had.
apologize. I was still referring to that
Okay.
page.
All right,
So
that's fine.
perhaps if we could put up the presentation again, and thank you very much. So on page 4 of the presentation that was provided by the OFB, if you look at the second or the third line, which has earned income tax credit reimbursements at $55.8 million, this is, again, something that for the first time our government is actually going to be receiving a reimbursement for. Historically, of course, our government has paid these out and has not been reimbursed for them. As I was just discussing with Director Byrne earlier, this actual item is something that, because it's new, we will have to work on an implementation plan with the IRS and Treasury for. So with regards to how this is to be paid to us, we're not yet sure of the exact details. And again, likely right after we're done with the Advanced Child Tax Credit implementation plan, which we're currently working on, then we'll begin to work on the earned income tax credit implementation plan. So again, it's not clear how this will be paid to us, whether it will be paid the way the advanced child, it will be paid to us the way the additional child tax credit currently is, which is as a reimbursement, or whether it will be paid to us in the way that I'll describe for what's going to happen with the child tax credit. And then if we go ahead and move down to the second to the last item in the provision for tax refunds, which is the child tax credit. So with regards to the child tax credit, this is the first time that we're going to be receiving reimbursement, or we're going to be receiving funding for this particular item, and that is for the amount that's showing as $31.59 million. That $31.59 million represents probably the average over the last 3 years or so of how much we've actually paid out and not been reimbursed for. The child tax credit, because of the ARP Act, there's two things that are going to impact Guam. The first one is that it's going to be reimbursed. The second one is that it is going to be, the second portion of it allows for an increase in the child tax credit. And to kind of talk a little bit about the child tax credit, there's actually two pieces to it. So if you look at the child tax credit and the additional child tax credit, those numbers are related. How it works is, in the current system, the total of the child tax credit before ARP was $2,000. So how it has worked is that between the child tax credit and the additional child tax credit, a taxpayer cannot get a refund or cannot get more than $2,000. So the sum of that is $2,000. Historically, the child tax credit has been what's called a non-refundable credit. And when we say non-refundable credit, it means that you can only get the credit to the extent of your liability, and you cannot actually get a refund of it. So, for example, if your tax liability is $1,000, but you actually would qualify for $1,200 of the child tax credit, you only get the child tax credit up to $1,000. You cannot get that $200. But of course, the Internal Revenue Service or the Treasury recognized that they want to try to give people the full amount. And so to the extent that, so in that particular example where my liability is $1,000, but how much I would be able to get for both the child tax credit and the additional child tax credit would be $1,200, then I would be able to possibly get that $200 as a refund on the additional child tax credit, right? And so, and maybe even to go further so that it's more clear, because the maximum that you can get is $2,000, right? So in another example, if my liability is $1,000, but I qualify for the full $2,000, on the child tax credit side, I would get the $1,000. On the additional child tax credit, I would get the $1,000, but I would not get more than $2,000 altogether, right? So I guess just to kind of clarify again, you cannot get more than the full $2,000 between the two. What the ARP Act did was it made the child tax credit a refundable credit. So now what's going to happen, and we'll go back to the example before, and we just kind of keep it at $2,000 for simplicity purposes. In a situation where I have a $1,000 tax liability and I have $2,000 or I qualify for $2,000, I would actually, on the CTC side, be able to get the full $1,000 as a refund, and it won't go. So then my additional child tax credit would then be zero, right? Because I cannot get more of a benefit. Because I've already used up the full benefit, right? $1,000 to reduce my tax liability of $1,000. The $1,000 as potentially a refund to me. So the additional child tax credit would be zero. And it's difficult to say how the tax return form, the Form 1040, is going to accommodate for that in the next year. But basically what we believe is that the additional child tax credit likely will go away because you'll be able to basically get it as the CTC. Okay, so that's kind of the first large piece of it. The second piece of it is that it increased the child tax credit from $2,000 max to $3,000 if you have a qualifying dependent that is aged 6 to 17, or $3,600 if you have a qualifying child that is under age 6, so from 5 and under. And so again, it increased that child tax credit by like 1.5 times or more. And so that's a large piece of it. And the last kind of twist to this all is that now 50% of this new amount is actually able to be received as an advance. So I know we're hearing a lot about these $300 monthly payments that the IRS is paying in this for this advanced child tax credit. That $300 is basically the $3,600, so they're assuming that your child is under age 6. $3,600 times 50%, right, which is $1,800, and then divided by 6 months, which is $300 a month. And so that's how that when we're hearing about in the national news the $300 per month, that's how that's calculated. And so, you know, as I was talking with Director Byrne earlier, we were talking about with regards to the child tax credit, already, you know, we're in the final phases of the implementation plan for that particular credit. We're hoping that that will be finalized very soon. But the monies that we're going to be getting for the child tax credit is actually going to have to be put into a trust fund. And so, in fact, that's something that is part of our implementation plan for this particular item. And again, so I think that Director Byrne had asked me this yesterday because, of course, as we're also working to project, we're looking at, in terms of the additional child tax credit, how much we're going to be looking at, you know, in terms of cash coming in. So again, like I mentioned, because the sum of the child tax credit and the additional child tax credit can't equal more than the credit itself, right? Whether it's the $3,600 or $3,000 now, $3,600 or $3,000 to come, or this year $2,000. What we're going to see again, because the characterization now is that they're both basically refundable credits, likely we're going to see if there is going to be if the additional child tax credit gets zeroed out, those increases will be moved to the child tax credit itself. I'm sorry. No problem. So because the sum of those two, right? So the additional child tax credit is just basically the amount that you would be able to get if you didn't already get it as a child tax credit. But, now again, you're going to be able to get that child tax credit as a refund, right? So that means now whatever's left over to get as the additional child tax credit will likely be zeroed out. And you will, if you qualify, get the full amount in the front end as the child tax credit. Yeah, so if you look at the two numbers, the 31.59 million and the 23.48 million, just to kind of illustrate perhaps what a potential scenario could be, that 23 million perhaps may be reduced to zero because now you won't see the amount there, but that 31.59 million will be increased by that amount because again, you'll be able to see the amounts be paid out as the CTC.
And for the record, we anticipate receiving, as you mentioned, in a federal trust fund, the funds to be able to make these payments. So they don't need to be appropriated. They don't need to be in the budget because we have these federal funds and she's working on the plan, but I don't believe that this is an appropriate depiction of a liability of the government of Guam in this scenario.
Are you expecting 50 million then in a trust fund? About 51?
Correct. So if these numbers hold, and again, these are just estimates, of course, we're still waiting for our final implementation plan to be approved and also for the amount of our actual CTC to be approved. And once that is provided, we will provide that. These are based on historical numbers, Madam Speaker.
Are you saying then this doesn't need to be a line item because does it need to be budgeted?
Yes, I am saying that I'm more comfortable, and I think my colleagues here agree with me, that how we've been budgeting in the past, where we take a provision for tax refunds from the gross, and then we net it out, seems to be more applicable because the $74 million number is a derivation of negative 145 plus 55 minus 35 minus 5 plus 31 plus 23. And I understand the logic in being able to do that, but I don't think that it is a liability that we're going to incur simply because Director Shimizu and our understanding of how this will be implemented, we will get money deposited with the government of Guam in a federal trust fund to make these payments, so we don't have a liability in that regard. The good news is that throughout the entirety of the fiscal year, when a taxpayer remits their withholding taxes, we benefit from the fact that we have that government revenue coming in, and then, as Director Shimizu mentioned, if you have a $1,000 tax liability, that is paid for from the trust fund. It's not a liability of the government of Guam if you have kids. Okay, again, this is applicable, and the demographics of people who have eligible children, I don't have those eligible children, but if that liability does exist, it is not a liability of the government of Guam.
So are you treating it like a federal fund that the legislature doesn't appropriate, so there's no reporting requirements?
Yeah, I don't believe it's necessary, simply because, first of all, it's all new. We don't know how much we're going to get in the trust fund, but I think you said 50% is going to be deposited of whatever the number is.
So with regards to we still don't have a final, I suppose that perhaps a safe it's safe to say that if we were getting, I suppose, if you say like 31 plus 23. So if you take the 31 plus 23, because we know that, that the child tax credit itself went from 2,000 to 3,000, you could take, I guess, 1.5 times perhaps and increase it by that. But again, it's difficult to say because we still haven't received our final implementation plan and we haven't been finally approved from the Treasury in terms of an actual amount that's going to be provided for us.
Does the OFB concur with this analysis?
Hold on, Lester. I'd have Steve comment to that so he can explain how in the previous year the 20 million existed, how it's minus from 145 makes 125. He can comment to that.
And Mr. Chair, I only asked the question because, I mean, I want to make sure also this body, I'm sure that there will be interest in the community. I mean, even if we don't end up adopting it as a liability and a revenue, I'm sure we would probably at least want to have a reporting requirement so that we understand the progress of the program. That's from our side of the house, I guess, but I want to get what you're thinking on the record.
You're correct, Senator. Let me just explain, and I say, when I presented the slide, when I mentioned the 100.
Can you pull up the slide 4, please, so that as we're talking about the slide, everyone can see it. There you go.
When I referenced the 145 million, the 145 million is in all 3 of the columns simply for presentation purposes. If you look down at where it says general fund provisional tax refund payments, that is exactly what's showing in the law and what is showing in the governor's request. But for presentation purposes, I didn't want to confuse anybody because the last column, the way it's broken down there, is not in the law and it's not in the governor's request. So I just wanted to make sure I was comparing apples and apples and not orange and oranges. But Mr. Carlson is correct. Presentation-wise, it's there. He said he understood it. The only question I believe now is maybe, timing. When are we going to get this money reimbursed? We don't appropriate X amount of dollars before the end of the year. Is there sufficient money to pay for the refunds? Those are some of the questions that can come about. But we were going under the pretense that this money is going to be reimbursed. And if it is reimbursed, why would we want to lock up all this money for refunds when we could allocate it for other purposes? That was my only concern, and that's why it was presented this way. But Mr. Carlson is correct. The 145 is not showing the executive budget, but it is shown here on my slide as the general fund provision for tax refund payments. That is what is showing in the executive budget. Okay? And you got to remember that the 145 has always been net of the 20. Okay? So last year, budget was net 20. This year's budget in FY21 is net 20, and the executive budget is always net 20. That's why we're working with 125. But just to present how the deductions are being made for both bills, if I didn't do that, there could have been confusion. You're going to ask, where's the $40 million? But I just presented this way just to see what was available after those bills were considered. That's all.
Mr. Carlson, if you want to continue, please.
I am a little concerned that while we need to pass a budget, there really is some uncertainty with the application of the ARP child tax credit, refundable credit, which was, again, as Daphne mentioned, wasn't the case before. I also believe that it would be probably in line with OFB's conservatism, which I appreciate very, very much, that we might want to consider revising this presentation of general fund revenue to be able to better align ourselves with what it is that we think we're going to be able to have to pay, and maybe take out the EITC because the EITC isn't the big monkey in the group, especially since further on in the budget, 35 million is taken away for the healthcare facility, 5 for DOC, and then the 15 is reserved for income tax refund. So for somebody like me who likes to drink beer and barbecue, it's a little hard to get across. And I think simple is better. I think we know we're going to get funding to be able to provide the child tax credit from the federal government. I don't believe we have to appropriate that. We don't know what it is, and quite frankly, I don't even know if Daphne has demographics on, people with kids and eligible wage earners, because you have to have a job and you have to file taxes to be able to avail yourself of the credit. I'm not real sure that this methodology that we're employing here gives us some comfort moving forward in then taking care of the rest of the appropriations that's necessary. I think if we maybe went back to something a little bit more simple, maybe simple is better. And for, again, clarity purposes, if you go back to slide 3, right? If you were to adjust the executive budget request number by the number that we just got, the disparity that we have between OFB's level and the executive budget request, it actually puts the executive budget request at 622 million and OFB at 617, just because of the fact that we have that one adjustment that wasn't equally applied. So when you actually apply that $11 million difference in Section 30, we're really not that far off. It reminds me of last year when I think we had a $7 million difference in general fund discussions. And again, for us to be that close before we, as we start the discussions is very heartening, because I don't believe the chasm is that deep.
Lester, I don't mean to jump in here. I know we have our round, right? But I think this is important on this one. So you got the number confirmed at this number. Does that mean that now we're done setting aside as we were before for the purposes of paying the war reparations? Is that doesn't have to be accounted for anymore in terms of the cap?
They did not take anything for war reparations. The information that I received was that they made adjustments for fiscal or calendar year 18 and 19, how we do reconciliations, because this is in advance. So what the information provided was that we've made the adjustments for 18 and 19. I think it was a -10 and a +6, which basically resulted in us getting this money. And I think I told Steve, and I typed to him what it was we received. It says net of adjustments and war claims. So yes, for this year, they're not taking anything for war claims.
That's a solid number. Okay, thanks.
Yes.
For the earned income tax credit, the executive request is $0, and then we have on slide 4, we have the FY22 OFB level at 55 million. I'm just trying to understand the logic of why are we accounting, why is the executive request not accounting for the 55 million? Is it the same purpose?
Actually, no, ma'am. We provided this funding to you in January. I think the American Rescue Plan was passed afterwards.
So are we using the earned income tax credit to pay back the taxpayers, or are we using it to appropriate? What is the executive request for that? Since this is something from January and we didn't know that we were going to get the reimbursable for 55 million, are we using this to pay back the taxpayers, or are we using it to fund other appropriations is the executive request?
I'll defer to Daphne on that.
Okay, thank you. So I asked Daphne that since the budget came in January and we were not tracking or we were not anticipating at the federal level to be given the reimbursement for the earned income tax credit. And now that we are getting the earned income tax credit, which should be paid out to the taxpayers, is the executive request still at zero, which means it's free for the legislature to appropriate all of this money and not give it back to the taxpayer?
So that, I'm sorry, Senator Nelson, I'm not sure
On
how
slide
that would
4?
work. But if I could just explain maybe the difference between, I'm sorry. So with regards to the earned income tax credit, it is actually something that the government has been paying out
Correct.
and just not being reimbursed for it.
Yes.
So the ARP Act really just allows now for the permanent reimbursement of this to Guam government. And so, historically, of course, these amounts have continued to be paid out as part of refunds.
Correct.
And so, in terms of the source of funds, I'm not sure. I suppose it's coming from this 145 or 125 million that has historically
How
been
about
set
page 4?
aside.
If you go to page 4?
Yes.
Are you on page 4? Okay, it says earned income tax credits, FY 2022 executive request, and that is at $0, right? Because this was submitted in January.
Correct.
And so on the right-hand side, we have FY22 OFB level at $55,830,695.
Right.
And so this was, I guess we could say, a liability, an unfunded liability, but now we are seeing that we are going to get this reimbursement from the federal government. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, so is the executive request still at $0 if the budget submission was in January and was not anticipating this $55 million to come from federal reimbursement? Or are we free to appropriate this money and not give it out to the taxpayers as it should?
So with regards to the 55.8 million and kind of compare it with how we're getting, sorry. So if you allow me to kind of explain a few things. With regards to the additional child tax credit, which we're currently being reimbursed for, what happens is, of course, we pay those out as refunds get paid, and then we submit a report to the Treasury and the IRS on a quarterly basis, and they reimburse us for the amounts that we've paid out. For the child tax credit, what's going to happen is we're going to be receiving an amount of money, of course, whatever it is that we've been approved for up front, that's going to go into a trust fund. And then as we pay those out, we'll go ahead and transfer those monies from the trust fund out into a checking account, and those get paid out as we go along. With regards to the earned income tax credit, I am not sure at this point how we're going to be paid for that. Likely, it's contemplated that we will be paid as a reimbursement because it's something we've been paid for. However, as I mentioned to Director Byrne, I think for us, it's always been very important that we try to maintain or keep intact the general fund as much as possible. So as we have not yet discussed the earned income tax credit with the IRS or the Treasury, but we've always like for example, we had asked for administrative costs so that we can make sure for certain programs that we were able to get those and not have to disturb our general fund. For this particular program for the earned income tax credit, again, I'm not sure how we'll get reimbursed. I'm hoping that we're able to get it to be provided to us in advance, similar to what we're seeing with the CTC, but I'm not sure yet because we haven't yet come to that point. And we probably will not be able to finalize something until maybe we get closer to the end of this calendar year, because we're still now in discussions on the child tax credit.
Okay, but you are anticipating to receive $55,830,695 for the EITC.
Correct.
And you're
again,
not sure at how you're going to deliver
Right.
it, right?
Senator Nelson, if I may, correct me if I'm wrong, Daphne, but the EITC will be effective for tax filers who file for 2021 in 2022.
Correct.
So our $125 million provision for tax refunds is the source of funds to pay for the EITC, and then only now are we aware of the fact, and thankfully, that we'll get a reimbursement. So we first have to get the people to file in January, more likely February, March, identify their eligibility for EITC, pay it from local funds, and then if we don't get, well, if we don't get a trust fund. So I think there's going to be a lag in the actual receipt of EITC just because of the cycle. And I'm not really sure in year one if we can count on, for the fiscal year, having $55 million. It might work out that way if we get a trust fund. And then the obligation isn't ours because it comes out of the trust fund. But if we traditionally, like ACTC before, we have to pay for it, and then definitely we submit quarterly, right, for reimbursement. So there's a lag in the receipt of the reimbursement. This is couched as a reimbursement. So I think there's
Right.
going to be,
Thank you, Lester. Just to understand it, is that we're still going to be able to pay $125 million in our tax refunds, right? And the liability of the earned income tax credit is included in that 125 million tax refund? Daphne?
Perhaps, I think to Lester's point, it probably will be a portion of it, and only because, as he mentioned, and thank you for reminding me, Director Carlson, that it will be after people file their 2021 tax returns. So if we kind of utilize the way that we do the ACTC is the way that we may be getting this, then it's possible that we may be not getting a portion of this reimbursement if it becomes if it ends up being a reimbursable type of credit. And again, in the way that we get ACTC currently, then maybe we won't see it until the second quarter of the calendar year next year. We may begin to see it. But again, it's not clear if we're going to get the full amount early on or if we'll get a portion of it, or if we'll get reimbursed as we go along because we don't have the implementation plan done yet.
Okay.
And if I may, that's why we don't appropriate ACTC, because we're incurring it, and then the legislation basically says whatever we get in a reimbursement, 90% goes back into the income tax efficiency fund, and 10% goes to DRT's operations. So we don't appropriate ACTC. And when Speaker Cruz was here, he even told us not to track it as revenue. So when you see our CRER, you'll note that we don't include ACTC reimbursement in the body, but we put it in a footnote, simply
Right.
because the uneven receipt, and it's a quarterly, and then when we get it, it's 90-10.
But I'm talking about the EITC,
Yes.
not the ACTC.
And it might be just the same as far as the reimbursement comes.
Okay.
We're not really sure.
So you're still trying to figure it out. So then my question is, not that you're still trying to figure out, but we're still waiting for more federal guidelines, right? So my question is that the $125 million in the gross provision for tax refunds, is that enough to also cover the EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit?
So yes, so historically that EITC has, my understanding is it's been coming out of the 125 million.
Okay, because they put 145 and then we were told to put it back down to 125. So I'm asking for 125.
Right.
Okay, so that means that even if the reimbursement does happen of $55,830,695, even if when the reimbursement happens, that all of our taxpayers are still going to get the EITC from the gross provision for tax refunds amount of 125 mil? Is that correct?
I suppose if we're continuing to keep consistent with how it's been paid, yes, then.
And the government will be able to pay out the EITC.
Right, and so, and actually, sorry, I know.
Without the anticipation of a reimbursement.
Right, and again, it's difficult to say if we're going to get it as an advance or as a reimbursement. The hope is that we get it as an advance, so we have the monies, but it's possible that the way that it gets treated, because again, we've been already paying it out as we go along, and then, because we've already been paying it out and we haven't been reimbursed for it, it's possible we end up getting it as a reimbursement, which would possibly bring us to about April 2022 when we begin to receive some back.
So I'm just trying to figure out, right, if the earned income tax credit reimbursement can be used to appropriate other things other than funding tax refunds,
And that
giving it
part,
back to the taxpayer.
that part, I'm sorry, Senator Nelson, I'm not sure. I mean, I do know that, of course, that earned income tax credit has been part of what has been paid out, part of that 125. In terms of the way that it's actually accounted for, that part I'm not, it's difficult to say. I'm not sure if maybe Director Byrne might have a comment on how the accounting for it would be.
Yes, because we're anticipating, it seems like in this budget bill, there's an anticipation that this money is going to come in. And so the anticipation that this money is coming in, it's going to be used to fund other things within the government. And if the money is supposed to go back to the people as a tax credit, we're kind of shortchanging the people when we can issue out their tax refunds at a quicker rate, as we know how the accounting goes. And so I'm just wondering, is there a timeline, and how are we going to move forward with this? Because right now in the budget bill, I've seen several appropriations for earned income tax credit that should go back to the taxpayers. So I just want to make sure that we're not using it that we're not shortchanging the people, and that we're able to pay out the taxes on their tax refund on time.
Right. And so, again, I don't know if maybe Director Byrne has some comment on that.
Senator, if I could pick this up from, yes, we are going to be able to pay the EITC as part of the tax refunds, principally because we're going to get it from the federal government. Therefore, it must be paid out to the taxpayers. So I think they're safe if that's the question you're asking. How we treat it is the second part of your question. For the child tax credit, if it's going to go into a trust fund, I can't put it into the general fund. It's just going to have to come in and out of the trust fund. As Director Shimizu said, we don't know what's going to happen to the EITC repayments or subsidies, or maybe it's an advance, maybe it's an arrears, we don't know. The accounting and cash flow treatment will be different, but it still will get paid out to taxpayers as we receive the funds from the federal government.
Okay, thank you.
Lester,
That's just my concern, is that we're using it. I understand how how we're calculating for these things. I just want to make sure that we're not shortchanging the people, and then we're expecting this $55 million where we can appropriate it someplace else, but accounting roles within the government.
All right, we've actually gotten out of order here, so the
I
way this
wasn't
is
done
supposed to
speaking,
go is we're
Mr.
supposed to
Chair. If you could
go,
have at least given me the courtesy
by
to
having,
finish speaking, thank you.
we're supposed to have rounds of questions later. I think we've gotten off track. At this point, I'm going to allow them to continue with their presentation and finish. Once the presentation is finished, then we will go to each senator, and each senator will have their 5 minutes to ask questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Rangel. The takeaway, I think, that in the last statement that we'd like to make is that I think we probably need to redraft this revenue section with the consensus, of course, of the body because of what it is that we've been discussing. I also, I believe, Steve, this was passed out to the body, the snapshot of July. Okay. Yeah. If you have it, could you? Okay. You want to pass this out? Since you guys like snapshots, we did a snapshot dated August 4th of July revenues. I'd like for you to take a look at where we are in comparison to the budget in advance of the official release of the CRER on the 20th.
Mr. Chair, can we take a short recess so we can all get a copy and follow along?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, we'll take a recess while we pass out the copies.
All right. The committee of the whole is back on order, called back to order. I ask my colleagues, we will not entertain any questions until they're finished with their presentation, the panel. After that, we will begin with Senator Tello to ask questions, and then we'll move across until we reach to the top. 2 rounds, 5 minutes. Your 5 minutes does not count the response. So if you speak 3 minutes on your one question, then you lose 3 minutes. Okay, just keep that in mind. Keep your questions specific, and so they can answer it, and you have all the time to speak. I would ask now the administration to continue their presentation so we can get to the questions of my colleagues. Mr. Carlson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Going back to slide 4, since we're kind of familiar with the information, it is our suggestion that the child tax credit and additional child tax credit numbers here, because we're very, very certain that we're going to get money in a trust fund, it should not be part of the general fund. Therefore, it shouldn't be in the presentation. Similarly, for the earned income tax reimbursement, if we get an advance from the federal government, then it'll be treated, as Senator Nelson mentioned, as a continual ability to provide funding for taxpayers. If it comes in a trust fund, we don't know. If it is a reimbursement, which we're hoping that it is, then the government of Guam, who pays out the EITC and gets the reimbursement, would be then able to use the money free and clear. But since we don't know, I don't believe it's appropriate to have any of these items in here. Once we find out what it is that's going on, particularly with EITC, we will notify you guys at a moment's notice what it is that the decision is, how the mechanisms work, whether or not this money, as Senator Nelson stated, may have to be utilized to the benefit of the people of Guam for facilitating tax refunds, or whether or not the reimbursement is available for appropriation. So therefore, I suggest to the body to consider removing those items, restoring the provision for income tax refunds to $125 million. And my last comment, I'll take you to page 3 of the presentation. Going up at the top, you'll see individual income tax at 71.9, executive budget request 71.2, OFB 71.2, same number. I'm glad that they agree. Going down to corporate, executive budget request 73.9, OFB suggested level 73.9. Withholding taxes, executive budget request level 235.4, OFB 235.4. What does that tell me? That tells me that there's a continual optimism in the continued individual, corporate, and withholding tax collections. They're in continual employment, business as usual, reemployment, and all the associated attributes that are cumulative derivatives of the income taxes. However, when we get down to BPT, the same optimism is not shared. If we're going to be collecting corporate income tax, withholding, and individual at a level we agree on, I think there should be some upward movement in the 238 that is provided by OFB. I passed out the sneak peek of where we are with July revenues for the body's consideration. And on page 3, it's page, I think the first page doesn't have a number, but the one that says page 3, under GRT, just the GRT portion, we've already collected $229 million for July, up to July. We still have August and September. And if you look at the page before it, you'll note that the period that we had given to you guys when we submit to the speaker the 12-month revenue allocation, we put down $23 million when we actually got 27.2, or almost $4 million more in the month of July. So I would suggest that the body consider an upward adjustment consistent with the tracking of what it is that we're collecting. And I would suggest that, and I thank OFB for the shared optimism on the three tax categories that precede BPT on page number 3. With that, I think that concludes our comments on the bill for this section.
So that concludes your presentation, correct?
And I do agree on the special fund revenues. I don't have any problem with how that came about.
So everything else, you're okay?
Yes,
The
sir.
administration. All right. So we'll now begin the questions of my colleagues, beginning with Senator Tello. Ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Regarding debt service, has the government of Guam experienced any delay or any other issues in making good on debt obligations during FY2020 and FY21, including those funded by the Tourist Attraction Fund and solid waste revenue? That was less than 20 seconds, okay?
That's a question, correct?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yes, please.
I'm sorry, I thought you were making an observation. What was the question?
No, there was a question mark behind it, but okay, counting down because you didn't hear it, don't hold that against me, Mr. Chair. Has government of Guam experienced any delay or any other issues in making good on our debt obligations during FY2020 or FY21, including those funded by the Tourist Attraction Fund and solid waste revenue?
None whatsoever. There were a couple months where we had to subsidize the payments for the hot bond, but we have very good news that hotel occupancy has picked up, TAF has picked up, and Mr. Byrne doesn't have to subsidize anybody. So timely payments are a paramount concern to us, and we have not made any late payments.
Did government of Guam experience any debt service savings during the past 2 years as a result of the financing authorization? And if so, where did the savings realized go toward?
I think Senator, if you take a gander at the 21 budget and you see the cumulative debt service, I think it was like 90-something million, and you'll see the substitute bill, which has got 66 million, if I'm not mistaken. So therein lies the cumulative results of, again, efforts that I applaud this body for authorizing. So last year's debt service, I don't have the FY21 budget in front of me, but I believe it was something in the neighborhood of $90 million.
Okay. Budget reserves, for FY 2020, Lester, how much in agency appropriation has the governor's office, BBMR, withheld in reserves for what proposes were their appropriations, and for what proposes were their appropriations used?
For which fiscal year?
2020. How much agency appropriations that the governor, they withheld in reserves?
Autonomous? I don't have any appropriation reserve authority for any autonomous agencies, nor do I have it for the legislature, Department of Education, Judiciary, and a multitude
In the
of
governor's office?
the governor's
And
office.
whatever the governor oversees. I mean, there's been withheld some reserves, and at the end of the year, those reserves, what did you do with it?
The reserves, Senator, we provide you a report. I think we provided it to you in either late November or December, where the governor exercised her transfer authority. We were obligated to report those transfers of funds where agencies lapsed and into agencies that had shortfalls. So that's a matter of public record that I believe the body has.
What about 2021?
We're not done yet, ma'am. And then I think I provide this body a quarterly appropriation reserve report for your review on what it is that's been continually held in reserve, as that's my only budgetary tool to ensure that we don't overspend, and if I have to ratchet back. So that's another report that is provided quarterly by statute to you.
Okay. Lester, you mentioned the war claims and regarding the Section 30 funding. And the funding source was used to support the funding sources were used to support advanced war claims payments that were made pursuant to Public Law 35-61. And were these funds replenished upon receipt of federal reimbursements?
We didn't get any federal reimbursements for war claims. That comes out of our back pocket until recently, when they decided it was sufficiently funded. So there's no reimbursements for war claims.
What funds did you use to replenish that account that was created to pay out the war claims early on? Where did that money come from? Mr. Byrne?
Yes, Senator, perhaps I can answer that.
Thank you.
The original amount to pay out the war claims, as this body is aware, came out of the general fund, and the federal government paid us back for the amounts that were paid out, and the amount was about 12.8 million.
I'm sorry, say again?
The amount was about 12.8 million.
According to the public law, the money was supposed to be put into an account, and that account would be drawn down to pay out those war claims early. And then once the reimbursement comes in from the Treasury, it goes back into that account. So are you telling me that you paid out the war claims and it was not drawn down from an account that was created to pay for it? You just took it out of the general fund?
There wasn't any money placed into that account, Senator, so we had no option but to pay it out of the general fund.
Okay, to date, do you know how much of the Section 30 funds have been withheld by the federal government and set aside for war claims?
I'd have to go back and reconcile that. I don't have the number off the top of my head.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll wait for the second round for the remaining questions.
Thank you. Senator Blas, do you have any questions for the panel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, actually, in the panel is also Mr. Gary Hiles with The Economist. Can I direct my question to him?
You're going to ask Mr. Hiles questions?
Mr. Hiles?
Yes, please.
Mr. Hiles, thank you very much for being here, and I'm sure you were wondering as to why. As an economist, what is your outlook over the next year, and as far as the economy and where we're going and what's happening?
Thank you for the question. This is a time with the greatest uncertainty we have in terms of the outlook that I've experienced due to the pandemic. There's some very strong indicators, primarily the short term. In the recent years, as the largest measures of the economy, we've seen it expansion for the last couple of quarters in terms of gross receipts, employment, hours worked, and a reduction in the last quarter in unemployment. I expect those trends to continue when the September numbers come out. The offset of the loss of the tourism revenue has been not entirely offsetting the loss of tourism revenue, but substantially so. And the outlook for additional federal revenue is quite likely, with the increase in the child tax credit, the infrastructure, the capital, the physical infrastructure bill looks like it will probably become law, and also the other soft infrastructure could have substantial funding for Guam. So far, I have a table on the federal, the DoD contracts are up this year from last year. from 167 million for construction to 294 million through December 18. Excuse me. The 2020 number, excuse me, is 280 million, up from 153 million for fiscal year 2019. So we expect federal construction to continue to expand. The federal government Senate passed a bipartisan 1.2 trillion traditional infrastructure program and a companion $3.5 trillion budget resolution for human infrastructure. That's got many steps to go through, but it's possible that that could increase the total funding, federal funding for Guam, and increase the total amount of money in circulation. So far, I have a report on the federal expenditures and obligations to date, and that shows that, I try to find the paper here, that the federal expenditures and obligations for Guam increased very significantly in the last fiscal year. Here it is. And so the total amounts obligated for Guam in calendar year 2019 was 1.9 billion. In 2020, 3.1 billion. In 2021, we're only through August, was already above last year's entire calendar year's appropriation. It's 3.5 billion. So last year was an increase of 66.5%. This year to date, and we're not complete with the year, already 10.6%, because there's compounding. The total increase in obligations of the federal government for Guam are 84% above 2019. So there's substantial optimism that federal expenditures on Guam could increase and help maintain the economy, offsetting much of the loss due to PUA. I want to talk about the PUA a little bit. From an individual standpoint, that's probably the biggest concern about the economy. That some of that loss will be offset by increased child tax credit. Daphne Shimizu, Director of Tax, mentioned that it's $3,000 or $3,600, but that's per child. So some families with multiple children could get a significant offset of the loss of their unemployment. Also, the Department of Labor has announced their plans to create a program to subsidize employers to help fill vacant jobs to further reduce the unemployment rate. This will be similar to the SBA program that subsidized employers for their current employment, but this one is a variation that tries to build the employment by subsidizing additional jobs. That's planning is well underway, and the dollar amount and the duration of it hasn't been finalized yet, but those things will help. So there's optimism that the economy could actually expand. However, there's many uncertainties in the legislative process of the federal government, and also with the pandemic, there's while vaccines are increasing in Guam and internationally with our tourism markets, it's also we're getting better in that respect, but then we've got variants coming up, so it's kind of a chase between the factors to see which predominates. So I expect to see some ups and downs, but there's a real possibility that the economy could actually expand. And the limited tourism will help with that, the more that expands as well.
Thank you. Okay, so you mentioned that, so 2019, we had about 1.9 billion. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And then 2020 was 3.1, and then right now we're tracking, and right now we're at about 3.5, 3.6, Bill?
As of August.
As of August.
Yes, and these are obligations, so these include actual payments as well as contractual obligations. So many of the payments from the federal government are like Social Security payments, federal retirees are payments, so the dollar amounts of obligations are the same as the expenditures. Other obligations, such as construction contracts, may spread over a period of years, so that's not necessarily the amount that will be spent in the upcoming year.
What do you attribute the over $1 billion worth of, I guess, the increase from 2019 to 2020 and 2020 to 2021?
The largest single factor was the PUA. I believe the total expenditures, the actual expenditures for fiscal year last year was $500 million.
Okay, so it's your position, the government's position then, that there's going to be sufficient and enough receivables or income coming in from the federal government to be able to sustain that? Absent PUA or absent any other?
Not absent anything else. With other things possibly coming in, it could. What actually gets passed through Congress and the amounts and the timing of it isn't known. So that's a reasonable possibility, but not a guarantee.
Okay, so that's your best case scenario. What's your worst case scenario?
The worst case scenario would be if additional federal money didn't come in, that the economy could contract.
Which would basically?
Reduced employment and revenues.
Okay, because, I mean, I appreciate that there's going to be a number of different contracts and federal money flowing as a result of, like you said, the infrastructure, the $1 trillion package that was just passed. So the assumption there is that then we're going to be able to fill these positions with the hires, with local hires for those individuals who can't get back to work, which right now, according to reports from Department of Labor and others, after PUA, you're looking at probably 14,000 people still not having jobs.
That's in the right ballpark.
Right.
Right now, there's about 10,000 people on PUA. About half of them are partially employed that have an income. And then there's persons, the PUA is only applicable to those that were actually lost a job and those business people, self-employed that lost business. The people that haven't been able to get a job, that they're new to the labor market or returning, those unemployed also are unemployed, but they're not covered under PUA.
Is it very safe to say that over the last couple of years it's been very difficult for you as an economist, or for any economist for that matter, to be able to safely, I don't want to say accurately, I don't want to use that word with you, but confidently predict what would happen over the next year or the next couple of years, because now things change almost every week?
Absolutely.
Okay.
If we know how much money is going to come in, it's not too difficult within a reasonable margin of error to predict how that will flow through the economy.
What's the reasonable margin of error? Last question.
guess that's subjective, I don't have a percent.
Okay.
But it's predicting the evolution of the pandemic and how that proceeds, and what Congress will appropriate is difficult to predict.
Okay, Mr. Chair, I know my time's about. Save my questions for next round. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Haas.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Senator Blas. Senator Tuttle, Mr. Lester has a response to your question. Okay, so he'll answer, and then we'll move on to Senator Pito.
Yeah, Senator, as of September 2020, the amount that was used for war claims, $39,685,966. And since they didn't take anything out this year, I think that is probably still the good number. Okay?
Thank you, Lester.
All right. Senator Pito Chalabi, do you have any questions, sir?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I just want to go to the revenue summary. And when we look at the revenue summary, for the total general fund revenue for 2020 is $610.195 million. And then we go down to the available, the appropriation for 2022 is $202 million. And the total special fund revenue is up to $109 million. And, well, the federal matching grant fund aid revenue is $109 million. So when you take a look at this, on this summary, on the executive budget request versus the OFB projection, we're talking about probably something like $200 million. Or so when you look at the budget, when we look at the budget documents, is it fair for me to say that I'm comfortable that we're going to be able to sufficiently have the money for the different agencies in our government based on the budget projection from OFB and versus the executive request for 2022?
Yes, Senator Talai. Just to clarify if I heard the numbers correct, the executive budget is requesting $610 million. The OFB budget is $617 million. The difference is $7.2 million. So if your question to me is, if the budget bill adequate to fund the departments and agencies for FY22, in my opinion, sir, yes.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. That's the only concern that I have, that we're going to be able to satisfy the budget request for the different agencies. And you're right, about 7 to 8 million over, with your projection. Thank you very much, sir.
Senator Pito, that's good?
Mr. Chair, that's it for now. Thank you
All
very
right,
much.
thank you. Senator Clint, do you have any questions, sir?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is for Mrs. Shimizu from the Department of Revenue and Taxation. I just wanted to get a little bit more clarity on child tax credits and additional child tax credits. Like my colleague was asking some questions earlier about sort of how these reimbursements are working, similar to the EITC. It's all very confusing. We've got the EITC, we've got the child tax credit, we've got the additional child tax credit, and there's different ways they're sort of all being administered. Some sounds like they're being paid in advance, some are being reimbursed. So I'd like to start, if you could explain again the child tax credit and additional child tax credit. Are they both reimbursements? Or are any of them advanced?
Thank you, Senator Rajal. So with regards to the CTC, this is going to be the first time that we're actually going to be given some type of reimbursement for that or some type of funding for it. My understanding is that that will be provided for as the monies will be received in advance and put into a trust fund.
So that will actually be an advance payment to
So-
GovGuam, similar to the EIP.
Correct. So
In
the
that
government
sense.
of Guam will receive monies that go into a trust fund, just like EIP.
So then it probably shouldn't be, that money shouldn't be appropriated since it's an advance. And instead, what should be done is whatever money is currently appropriated to pay for this should be de-appropriated or minused out, and then that can be used to go to other areas.
You know, on the accounting side and how that gets accounted for and the source of funds, that's not really my area of expertise. I'm going to have to perhaps defer to.
Sure, maybe I could ask Mr. Byrne if you could explain maybe how that would be administered from DOA's perspective. You're getting child tax credits paid up front, right? So budgeting-wise, we actually shouldn't budget for that. That's already being covered. We should just minus that amount out of whatever our budgetary liabilities are, out of our appropriations for tax.
Yes, Senator, thank you. Since we're getting it up front and it's going into a trust fund, it can't also be accounted for in the general fund. So I agree, it shouldn't really be included in this reconciliation. It'll just go in and out, as you say, similar to the EIP, out of the trust fund.
So it should be like, so for example, with the child tax credits, we've got 31.5 million, right? So we should just subtract that 31.5 million out of whatever, and it looks like, I'm not sure if that's what OFB did here. They might have done it that way. But that should be minused from the total 145, right?
Yes, and I think Director Shimizu was saying that since the additional child tax credit is now being effectively subsumed by the child tax credit, it will be treated in the same way because the whole is reimbursable.
Right. So to clarify, yes, so what I had mentioned earlier, likely because of the way that the child tax credit is now being characterized as a refundable credit, we won't see this 23.4 as a separate line item as we see it now. We'll likely see it kind of be added to the CTC. Again, because the ACTC is really kind of an extension of the child tax credit. It allows for somebody to get the full amount, the $2,000, you know, if you don't have enough tax liability to offset the non-refundable portion.
So you're saying the two amounts will probably be combined into one amount and all of it advanced?
Correct.
So 50-some million, 54 million advanced?
Right. So to clarify, the CTC itself will continue to be the CTC. The ACTC may end up, which we currently, again, get reimbursed for, may be zero. So we'll see the CTC increase. We'll see the ACTC perhaps decrease, perhaps to zero, potentially. So we likely won't see what's currently called the additional child tax credit. We'll likely see, again, an increase in the child tax credit, and then that ACTC, that additional child tax credit, to be reduced. So it won't be considered an additional child tax credit anymore. It will actually be characterized as the child tax credit.
It'll just be part of the child tax credit?
Correct. Only just the child tax credit portion and not the additional.
But you don't know yet, and you don't know the amount exactly that the additional child tax credit could be reduced or...
As I mentioned, you know, I mean, we can make an estimate because, you know, we know that the child tax credit is going from 2,000 max to 3,000 or 3,600. You can, which is, I mean, at least 1.5 times more than the 2,000, right? If you calculate it at 3,000. So if you, and again, we don't have the final approval of how much we're going to be receiving, et cetera, so it's difficult to say. But if you were to go ahead and take, I suppose, the two amounts together and multiply it by 1.5, because again, going from 2,000 to 3,000, you can make the assumption, at least just to provide kind of a general estimate of how much that will be, which will be about, yeah, well, anyway, you take the two amounts and multiply it by 1.5. Again, that would be a general estimate, but we don't have a final.
But you think that both will be advanced?
Correct. I believe that we'll receive that child tax credit again, because if the additional child tax credit basically goes away, we'll receive that amount as the child tax credit as an advance is the way that it looks based on our discussions with the Treasury. And we're hopeful that those discussions will be completed very soon, so we'll see it actualize, and we'll be able to report back to the legislature on exactly what it is.
Thank you. With the EITC also, is that going to be done through reimbursements?
And that's something that's difficult to say because, again, currently we don't get reimbursed for it. And again, it's based upon, it's difficult to say because it's really based upon how the Treasury decides they wish to structure that for Guam. But, of course, what we want to ask for is for that to be received in advance, so we have it in advance of us paying versus having to pay it out and then get later reimbursed, right? So I think that the ideal would be that, but we don't know yet what will happen because we haven't begun those discussions with the IRS yet.
So it's possible that even the EITC could be an advance payment, similar to the EIP, put into a trust fund upfront.
That's a possibility, yes, Senator Rajal.
Thank you. I have no further questions, Mr. Chair, but I'd like to yield my remaining time to Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Senator Clint. Senator Nelson, you had a motion to make, and then we'll get back to Senator Paris. Ma'am?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I'd just like to make a motion to recess till tomorrow, or Monday at 9 a.m. If we can make that motion now.
My colleagues will recess until Monday at 9, and I ask the panel to please return on Monday at 9 a.m. So my colleagues, please review your documents so when we come back, we can move along. Thank you. We are now at recess till Monday at 9 a.m.